Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Julia Kim. Here's what's coming up on the programme today. Months after an investigation was launched into the devastating Beirut port blast, not a single person has been held accountable. Instead, politicians are doing all they can to obstruct the probe. Also coming up, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Siamak Namazi are among an unknown number of Iranian dual nationals still detained in Iran. We'll speak to analyst Bijan Kajapur about hostage diplomacy and what that means for those imprisoned by Tehran. And a nude photo shoot to raise awareness of the receding Dead Sea. Experts say the Earth's saltiest sea could disappear altogether by 2050. But first, we begin in Lebanon, and it's now months into an investigation of the Beirut port blast, but no one has yet been held accountable. Now, politicians have repeatedly obstructed the work of the lead judge, Tarek Bitar. Last week, Hezbollah led a protest to demand his dismissal. It sparked a gun battle in the heart of Beirut that left 7 people dead and reignited fears of fresh sectarian violence.
August 4th, 2020, a double explosion rocked the port of Beirut. Several whole neighborhoods were wiped off the map. 216 people died and thousands were injured. The cause, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate abandoned at the port back in 2013. Officials blamed negligence and vowed to prosecute the guilty.
The investigation into the port blast was and will remain a priority of my work and of my commitment to the Lebanese and the international community.
Yet 14 months after the tragedy, the investigation has made little progress. It's already been suspended 3 times by 2 different judges. The first, Fadi Sawan, was dismissed from his post last February after indicting senior officials and questioning deputies. His successor, Tarek Bitar, was denied the opportunity to question a dozen elected officials who say they have immunity. Now he's under pressure, with questions raised about his impartiality and facing calls to resign from other politicians. He's also been threatened by Hezbollah. According to Judge Bitar, relatives of members of the Shiite movement were aware that the ammonium was being stored at the port of Beirut.
Today we are dealing with a new equation. Either Judge Tarek Bitar leaves or the country will be ruined. And now we're still faced with this dangerous equation.
On October 14th, the frustration surrounding the investigation spilled over into the worst street violence Beirut has seen in over a decade. As Hezbollah and its ally, the Amal movement, marched through the capital to demand the judge be replaced, shots rang out, killing 7 people. Hezbollah accused Lebanese forces snipers of being behind the shootings.
Note this figure. We have 100,000 fighters, men who are trained, organized, structured, armed, experienced, full of spirituality, ready for battle.
Worries are growing that the investigation, which is being seen as a test of the judiciary's independence, will also be the trigger for new clashes.
Well, as you heard in that report, rising tensions and a ballooning economic crisis. It's against this backdrop Lebanon marked the 2-year anniversary of its popular uprising. On the 17th of October 2019, citizens united across sectarian lines against the country's political elites. In 2 years, several prime ministers have resigned, while nearly 80% of the population have been dragged into poverty. Just a few hundred people turned out on Sunday for a muted demonstration in Beirut, a far cry from the hundreds of thousands that formed Lebanon's biggest protest movement in years. Now, in the past week, British-Iranian prisoner Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe lost her appeal against a second jail sentence in Iran, prolonging her 5.5-year detention. A few days before that, American-Iranian prisoner Siamak Namazi marked 6 years since his arrest in the Islamic Republic. Both have been tried behind closed doors and charged with offences including espionage, allegations they deny. They're among an unknown number of dual nationals imprisoned in Iran, used as pawns in a geopolitical game between nations. Hostage diplomacy is the term that's been used to describe their ordeal. And for more on that, we can speak to analyst Bijan Kajapur. Bijan, thank you very much for joining us today on Middle East Matters. I'd like to start by asking how Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Siamak Namazi were picked by Iranian authorities.
Unfortunately, hostage diplomacy or taking hostages has become a tool for the Islamic Republic of Iran to achieve its diplomatic goals in the relationship with some countries. And obviously, Nazanin and also Siamak, they both have a second nationality that represent countries with which Iran has issues. Britain in the case of Nazanin and the United States in the case of Siamak. So Iran takes these dual nationals, completely innocent dual nationals, hostage to achieve specific goals. In the case of Nazanin, to retrieve an old debt that the UK has to Iran. And in the case of Siamak and other Iranian-American dual nationals, demanding that the US frees up certain frozen assets of Iran. There are conventional diplomatic ways to achieve these goals, but unfortunately, certain segments of the Iranian political establishment believe that this is the way to do it by taking hostages and demanding a ransom, which is very unfortunate.
These countries, Britain, America, France, are these countries doing enough to bring their citizens back home?
Basically, the problem is for all of these states not to allow hostage diplomacy to become the norm in the relationship they have with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So some of the governments are hesitant to engage Iran on releasing the hostages. Others try to use other diplomatic instruments. In my view, it has backfired for Iran. It has created a very vicious, cruel image of Iran that does not have any sense of justice and mercy towards its own nationals. We should not forget all of these hostages are also Iranian on one part, and most of them have actually cared for Iran as their hosts, as their home country, and the price that Iran is paying is huge. But I'm sure personally that more can be done, but I also understand all the complexities of these negotiations.
You touched on that there. Iran is partaking in hostage diplomacy, knowing that it's damaging its image to the international community. Do they simply not care anymore?
I would argue that segments of the Iranian political establishment, segments that we refer to as hardliners, not only they don't care, they actually also would like to achieve something else, which is creating a greater distance between Iran and especially Western governments, and especially the United States. By arresting and mistreating dual nationals, they also achieve the fact that less and less Iranians living abroad, the Iranian diaspora, return to the country. And by reducing the impact of the Iranian diaspora, they also reduce, let's say, the impact of a closer relationship with the Western countries. And that is really one goal of this whole process. And that's a goal that I think is certainly on the agenda of the more hardline elements in the Islamic Republic.
And just one final question, very quickly. For Siamak Namazi and Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, what are their chances now of being released, of returning home?
I think a lot will depend on how the so-called Vienna talks on the revival of the nuclear deal, of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, will proceed. And if the JCPOA negotiations are successful, then I'm personally hopeful that that the dual citizens, the hostages, would be released. At the same time, Iran has just come out and said to the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, that they would like to treat the prisoner exchange as a separate matter to the JCPOA. But reality is that that's the Vienna talks, the only venue where talks could take place to achieve the release of these innocent hostages.
Okay, Bijan Kajapur, thank you very much for talking to us here on Middle East Matters. We really appreciate your time. Well, we're going to move on now to Israel, where a nude photo installation has been held to draw attention to the rapidly disappearing Dead Sea. The project by American artist Spencer Tunick saw hundreds of people wearing nothing but white body paint gather in a nearby stretch of desert. The Dead Sea is receding by 1 meter per year due to climate change and the diversion of water for agriculture. Some experts believe it could disappear altogether by 2050.
300 bodies, naked and motionless, as if frozen in the desert landscape of the Dead Sea. Behind the lens, the American photographer Spencer Tunick. He's painted his models white, a reference to the biblical episode of Lot's wife, who was transformed into a statue of salt in this very place.
Number one concern is the sustainability of life of both Jordan and the Bedouins and the Palestinians and the Israelis, because water is a source of life, and so we need to find a way to get water to the Dead Sea.
It's the photographer's third project to warn about the drying up of the Dead Sea. A year after gathering over 1,000 participants for a mass nude shoot in the sea, he organised this environmental float to raise awareness about the dangers to one of the world's most unique ecosystems. The lowest point on Earth, at 430 meters below sea level, the Dead Sea is receding at around a meter per year. Its surface area has shrunk by a third since 1960, as Israel and Jordan divert much of the upstream water sources for agriculture and drinking water, a situation that has people concerned.
So we came here today to raise awareness for the Dead Sea that is disappearing because of many cultural, political, and economical reasons.
According to experts, if nothing is done, the Dead Sea could disappear by the year 2050.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of Middle East Matters. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us. There's more world news coming up here on France 24.